Hi everyone, to my talk, The Modern State of Web Components. And in this talk, I actually want to show you, first of all, how the development of web components has progressed in the last couple of years and what we can already do today when we want to build native web components, and also how Glimmer.js, the new UI library we already heard a lot about today, can actually help us to achieve that. But before we get into the topic, I just want to quickly introduce myself as well. So I am currently a very art-interested, program-interested, and hipster-interested person living in Berlin. I'm also a software engineer working at SimPlabs, a software company based in Munich you already heard about from Marco. And I'm also a co-organizer of both the ember.js Berlin meetup. So if you're ever in town and want to join us or maybe also give a talk, please give us a shout out. And last but not least, also one of the co-organizers of different workshops under the umbrella of Open Tech School Berlin, which is an organization that tries to encourage people to do free coding workshops to provide learning resources around technology, which is really cool. And also, if you want to find me on GitHub or on Twitter, you can find me just as Jessica Jordan or as with this very memorable handle here. So with that said, let's get actually into the topic. If you think about how we build client-side apps today and also how we actually do any kind of front-end related work, we realize that in the last couple of years, we actually had a very steep increase of how much complexity and functionality actually gets dragged into the client side to build our applications. And we realized also as well that along the way, there has been the rise in the popularity increasing of different frameworks, libraries that helped us to achieve that. So starting in 2006 with the first release of jQuery, we already could create UI-driven widgets or also our own jQuery-driven applications. But we realized that with increasing complexity, there was the need for better patterns and better designed libraries to achieve that. And along this timeline, I realized there has been the rise of several different frameworks that are not all listed here. It's a huge vast of amount. And we will see that now there's this really diverse ecosystem of different frameworks that we can actually opt into to create our JavaScript, MVC, or MV*-driven applications. And along this timeline, we actually also, maybe already a few years ago, committed to building our applications in a certain framework. And this commitment kind of draws back to the thing, or the kind of fact that we also became more fluent in actually building our applications with a certain framework, but also that our projects grew and that we realized, oh, it's actually not so easy anymore to migrate it to another framework. Just pin this in mind, this slide, and also the fact that currently there's a diverse ecosystem, and we realize we are kind of following a certain framework to achieve our application development today. And what we also see in the last couple of years is that these MVC or MV*-driven frameworks actually try to decompose the classical MVC-driven monolithic approach down to a more component-based approach. So it is encouraged to encapsulate and also compose functionality that can be easily reused inside of our applications in the form, for example, in Ember components. And this is kind of an interesting aspect because this gives us a lot of benefits on the one hand for less mental overhead about which kind of functionality is related to which kind of view in our application. We also can easier extend already created components and functionalities for more special use cases. And last but not least, we also get the ability to actually reuse our components whenever we want without having to rewrite functionalities again and again for other instances in the app. And the cool thing is about components as well, especially in the Ember ecosystem, that we already found a way to actually extend components outside of a certain source app, I would say, into other Ember apps with the means of add-ons. So what has been very popular already is creating UI library add-ons that actually enable us to easily reuse already created components from other add-ons in our app without having to rewrite all of this ourselves, which highly increases our productivity. But then if we think a little bit step further, like not only beyond the app boundary, but also beyond the framework boundary, we realize there's still a link missing. So if I have a very simple UI widget that could actually be nicely reused, not only in my Ember app, but maybe in another React app I'm working in, then I realize, yeah, this is actually not so easy. I actually cannot achieve this because my Ember component is already kind of like stuck down to patterns conventions that are used in Ember, but they are not interoperable with, for example, another framework-driven application out of the box. And this kind of point is probably, yeah, the most exciting thing about the new paradigm around native web components, which we will have a look at and to see how actually open web standards and the native implementation of web components can help us to, yeah, kind of like fill up this missing link that we currently see. If you have a look at the web component specification, we can actually decompose the spec into 4 major specifications that are currently in different states of the working draft. So first of all, we have the template, which is already finished in its working on, and this already found its way into the HTML5 spec. Then we also have the custom element spec, which is kind of like crucial also for the rest of the talk. So we have a closer look to that in a minute. Then also we have the shadow DOM spec, which is interesting in composing functionality and actually like encapsulating it away from our target app inside of our components. And last but not least, also the HTML import specification. And just having a closer look at, as I already mentioned, the custom elements specification, we will see that this comes with a really cool new interface, the custom element registry, which enables us to actually extend the HTML element class and create our own custom classes that we can easily use to create our own custom elements. And if we define one of these, we can later on with the define method in our DOM actually register these elements and make them available with a simple HTML tag. And currently, this define method will accept a name under which this is like actually registered in our DOM. Then also a constructor, so like the class we already defined earlier. And last but not least, also an options parameter, which currently only supports the extends property. And with that, we can actually define that we also want to extend an already created native element. So if I, for example, wanted to have like a special button, I could just like describe I would like to extend the native button element. And then I could later on easily build my own custom functionality on top of the already native button element, which is pretty cool. And just to have a look at how this looks like in a fuller picture, we can easily see that this extension of the HTML element class allows us to do a lot of like, it increases a lot of our flexibility to actually create these components. And what we can do in the constructor function is actually do all kinds of like setup work that should be done when the component is initialized. And we can also, for example, add native event listeners that will actually get triggered when, for example, a click element event happens. And then last but not least, we can define that. So in this example, we would, for example, would like to have an image that is actually linked with an URL. And the URL and also like the image source are configurable. And we did all of this. We created the class. We defined it as a custom element. And then later, we can actually simply create an HTML tag with the name that we have already declared and just pass in the name, for example, of our alt attribute, of the image source, and also last but not least, the link that we want to link to with simple string attributes. And this is actually quite beautiful, I think, because it's a very straightforward way for us to reuse functionality with the probably most basic but also most important technology that we know on the web, HTML. So now we had a look a little bit more in detail into a specification that looks actually quite promising. But now let's also have a look at the browser support. And if you have a look at that, we already talked about it. The HTML5 spec already contains the template specification So here the support is actually quite good. So we are quite good to go with that. Then we have a look at custom elements. Actually quite, crucial feature in my opinion for the web component spec. And then we see, okay, like most modern browsers have it, but then, okay, Internet Explorer, Edge is already opting out. There's currently still a vote process ongoing if the implementation should actually happen. Then if you look at a little bit even more, I would say, controversial specification, we realize, okay, here's the support even a bit less. In Firefox, you currently still have like a bug in the basic implementation of that. Also not so good. And then we go to the HTML import, and then, it doesn't get better. So if you're seeing that, first of all, we get all our hopes up. Looks really cool. Then we go like, okay, browser support, a little bit depressing. But the good thing is, obviously, we already heard it earlier in the talk about IndexedDB. We can, of course, also polyfill that. And for example, we can install a Bower package or an npm package that are currently mostly pushed by the Polymer community, like a library around web components. And we can just get all of these specifications and implementation out of the box once we load this into our app as well. So this actually sounds quite okay again, like life is good. And what we also by now have is quite a diverse ecosystem of different libraries that actually help us to build components out of the box, probably with Polymer the most notable one so far. There are different others that I haven't worked with so far, but they'd also support a lot of like the native implementations of web components already, and that also have their own kind of like small UI libraries already of different web components. But luckily as well, for us as Ember developers that are already very in love with syntax and the building tools around the community, there's now even more. And you can probably imagine, because this is the main topic, it seems, today at this conference, it's Glimmer.js. And with Glimmer.js, we also have the opportunity now to actually create native web components. And let's maybe have a look at a quick demo how this actually could look like when we want to implement that. So imagine you would have UI widget that just simply renders a voting poll, so people can, for example, vote for their favorite editor. As you can see, of course, Nano is the most favorable one for everyone, right? And then when we actually want to get started, we can actually simply install Ember CLI. And what we get is then the latest release, 2.14, with which we can actually build our Glimmer apps. And then we can use the blueprint for Glimmer and also the web component flag to get, kind of like our first setup started to get coding with our web component. And what we also get is like this file structure. And as you can see, this also follows the new module unification API spec. We have like our source folder. We also have like a configuration directory, and also our styles are associated here. And what we can also see here in the ending of our component is actually that, first of all, we have handlebar templates as well, so very similar to how we are actually used to do templating in Ember. And last but not least, also the TS ending, which indicates that here we are also working with TypeScript files. And the cool thing is as well with TypeScript, it's not something that you have to opt in to actually create your components, but it's like a superset of JavaScript. So this means you can just like type check as much as you want to a certain extent on top of it, but you don't have to. So like also simple JavaScript files already valid TypeScript technically. And looking into how actually our app is booted up, we can have a quick look into the index TypeScript file. And what we will see is here is actually like the magic happening to get our Glimmer app running once we use Ember CLI when we serve it. So we will get an app instance, and then we will also see where our container element is, which is kind of like interesting. So everything that is defined here will actually be the container for what we want to render as our component. And then we can simply use the render component API from Glimmer.js to actually render it and boot it up. And here inside of the initialize custom elements method, actually the registration of the native web component is happening. So we also will see in there the custom elements define method being called to actually register the component in the DOM. So this is actually already quite good. We can also see it here like shortly. We create here like prototype of a Glimmer element, and here is actually like where we register the web component in our DOM. Also, what I found really interesting with working with Glimmer was how dependency management is actually handled. So how it works right now is that E6 modules, or modules that are exported as E6 classes can be imported out of the box. If you, for example, have like modules that are still written in the common JS module syntax and exported, you can also opt into that with a simple configuration here, ember.js build. So this works also quite nicely. And also for any kind of like functionality that I at least had the feeling shouldn't be in my component.ts file, I can simply organize all of them, for example, in a utils folder, and then import them simply into my component. And this, I think, is like already quite nice to see how you can organize your component later on. Also interestingly for Glimmer.js, we now have a little bit like a different syntax on how our classes should look like. We don't work with computed properties anymore to actually track changes, but with the track decorator. And here we can also simply indicate that this property is not something that will stay like this once the app has been rendered for all of the time, but might actually change. So this kind of like property is not immutable. And what we then can say, we just like track it. So this might change at any time point, and we might assign a new value. And also what we then, for example, can do is also create actions that actually change these properties. So here, for example, for this polling component, we actually want to fetch some data from the backend. And for example, we already have a put data utility that we imported earlier here that would actually do like the fetching for us with the new fetch API. And then later on, we can actually assign the data that we got to our fetch poll data property that is already tracked. So this is also, I think, quite nice. Tom Dale already mentioned it on last EmberConf, that this is kind of like a promising development of the API, because it seems, it seems some developers in the community are very fond of this kind of like syntax to actually set properties, like not using setters and getters, but actually like simple assignment. And I think it's also really cool to just like get started and experiment with that when you are creating your first web component in Glimmer.js. And what is now interesting actually, okay, now we built this web component, how do we actually get this into our target app? And how it works right now in the kind of like workflow, it's like simply that in your dist folder, you will actually find like an app.js file that is built with ember.js. And what you can simply do is just like import it, for example, in your other app, and then later on just like declare the image tag, no, not the image tag, the Glimmer poll tag that we already have registered as a custom element. And also any kind of like other assets could be loaded here. Also importantly, you still would have to load your polyfill to actually make all of the native functionalities work out of the box. So this is like already the journey around how you would create a web component in Glimmer.js today. And finally, I just want to kind of like summarize all of this with some thoughts on like promising API developments for the future. And there have already been quite a lot of like interesting discussion about how actually the API should look like for actually building your web components in Glimmer.js, what kind of like parts of the specification should actually be supported. Because as you could already see in the browser support, even like browser vendors are currently still highly discussing which kind of like APIs and which kind of like parts of the spec actually make sense to implement. And there's not like a uniform decision process involved yet. But I think there are some of them that are actually quite useful and where a lot of people actually agree this is like important to actually have. First of all, this might be the ability to actually customize and configure mostly UI-driven decisions in your web component with string attributes. So let's imagine we wanted to actually like define how the width and the height of our widget is without actually having to go into the JavaScript and change it and actually make it like customizable for better reusability later on. We could just like have a width or like a height attribute. How this should be handled in the spec, it's just like a string attribute that you can just like pass in. So like mostly number values or like, just like strings might be, like classic strings might actually be favorable for that. What is also interesting to think about is how would we actually handle like more complex data, like for example objects or arrays. And interestingly, with other libraries, how they approach this is a little bit like we can actually just stringify any kind of objects, for example, and just pass them in. But I can also see from this kind of approach that this is not really something for very complex, very convoluted data, right? So this is still a point of discussion if this should be something that is supported with just string attributes. And what might also be a point of discussion is, do you actually just want to support string attributes, or do you want to have something more similar to Ember that you actually can bind data with your JavaScript? So yeah, this is, I think, an interesting point for discussion. Also, HTML imports are actually widely adopted in some other UI libraries, although it might also be interesting to think about, does this actually make sense? I think the beauty of it is that we can simply use a very basic and very well-known kind of technology to actually import any kind of assets or things that we want to load on our web component easily without having to figure out different kind of loading systems, different kind of syntaxes for exporters. We can simply just drop an HTML tag and actually get all of this out of the box. But yeah, also comes with its limits when we think a step further and think about how can we actually handle more complex approaches with that. And last but not least, what might also be quite interesting is to see what is still happening right now development-wise with Glimmer.js and web components is that first of all, the slot API that we have for components is also something that is currently highly worked on. So this is something that enables us to actually render content as a block, as we already know it, with Ember components inside of a component, which is kind of related to how we think about Shadow DOM and is really interesting and I think also very important for the web component implementation. Then also the question around styles is still not, as far as I know, please correct me if I'm wrong, figured out. But there might also be an intention to actually do co-located CSS inside of our kind of component structure. And also what is really interesting to see is now how the testing story for Glimmer.js in general, but also for web components turns out. And there currently is also a lot of work going on. Here you can, for example, see a PR that just has been recently merged from Robbie Pitts about actually implementing tester boilerplates for Glimmer.js, and also a big RFC about exactly for the new QUnit testing API by Robert Jackson is also ongoing. That actually will help us to use an even more beautiful testing API in Glimmer.js apps. And with that said, I think we can summarize that with Glimmer.js, we actually are now in a spot where we can opt into developing new cool things for actually quite fresh and really cool new API web components. And I believe these are actually quite exciting times to now join the project as well, and also to see what it has in it for the future. And with that said, thank you very much.